Well, I wanted to create a presentation about how to make PowerShell modules. So before we get started, let me ask you this. How many of you guys have written static scripts? Show of hands, everybody. Okay, cool. How many of you have added parameters to those scripts? Okay, pretty much still everybody. What about functions? We're all familiar with those? A few less hands. Maybe you've built your own modules already and you just wanted to come hear me ramble. Okay, a couple. How many of you are hosting your own NuGet server? I want to have beers with you later. All right, so who am I? My name is David Whittaker. I work for Pure Storage. I'm a senior architect with the advanced services team. We design custom solutions for our customers. They come to us, they need integrations. And so I work a lot with PowerShell, and I wanted to share some of my experiences and how we wound up here. We found that a lot of our customers were asking for very similar things over the years. And so we'd go back and look through previous solutions that we had delivered to them, and there would be overlaps. It's all variations on a theme 9 times out of 10. We'd have maybe, let's say, 3 dozen actual solutions, but we'll have hundreds, thousands of scripts. And so at a certain point, we said, well, enough is enough. How do we start consolidating this and work smarter, not harder? And that led us down the rabbit hole of building our own internal modules. So first, we have to thank our corporate overlords. And all joking aside, this is the reason we're here, so thank you to them. All right, so we've kind of already gone over this. Is this talk for you? You know the basics of PowerShell, you think it's cool, and you're tired of writing the same thing over and over again. Great. So if you guys are going to be following along today, or if you want to download this for your home use, I'm going to leave the GitHub repo up for at least the duration of this conference, and then I'll pass that off to the folks that are running the organization. They'll have it up on their GitHub repo afterwards. But for this week, you can use the link that's going to be in the slide notes. So without further ado, there is the link. I'll give you all a minute if you want to download it. Cool, we'll move on. So, first, a note about formatting. Who's seen code like this? Come on, you know who you are. We've all been there, right? Don't be this guy. I cannot tell you how many 5,000 line scripts I've had to debug over the years that look like this. So before we even get into how to build a function or how to make a module or how to upload it to the PS gallery, a quick note, formatting. Formatting matters. Clean code makes for happy engineers because at some point somebody's got to troubleshoot this code. Oftentimes it's going to be future you. It's going to be a year from now. You're not going to remember what the heck you were thinking when you wrote that code. Maybe there was some operational issue and you had to do something that violated a best practice. Maybe there was something wonky that made sense at the time but doesn't now. Make a future note to yourself. Future you will thank you. So, there is no official style guide for PowerShell. There are some unofficial guides. I've included a link to one of the more popular ones in the labs. But some of the more important ones that I've found is use Pascal case for function and variable names. It just makes things easy to read. What that means is you'll have a single word that might be a concatenation of multiple words. Just capitalize the first letter of each of them. Make your variable names easy to read and understand. I have seen so many times where someone will say obj VM instead of just VM. And that's fine if you have a 3-line script, but when you're going through thousands of lines and none of the names make sense, it becomes very difficult and you get lost very quickly. So just try to make things as close to common English as you can. If something's a VM, call it a VM. If it's a hard drive, call it a hard drive. Maybe call it a disk. Pick whatever name makes sense, but be consistent. Another big one, make sure that you indent all of your code blocks. So what does that mean? If I have curly brackets, if I maybe have square brackets that are going multi-lines or parentheses that are going multi-lines, make sure that you nest that every time that you hit enter. So another note, backticks are the devil. Who here uses backticks? You don't have to raise your hand. I'm going to assume there's at least one of you in the room. So a backtick, does anybody know what a backtick actually does from a technical standpoint? I know who we're going to wait. If nobody else gets it, you can say it. Very good. Why is that useful and why is that bad? Anybody else? Correct. An escape character is useful for escaping things, which can be a double-edged sword. So let's just get out of our presentation real quick and we'll do this live. All right, I've got an example of this. So this new item for my present working directory, I've got a bunch of different parameters here. What happens if I put a space here? That might be a little small for you. All right, what happens if I put a space right here? Let's find out. Let's copy this into a live PowerShell session. Okay, so our present working directory is just my user profile. We have a what if. In this case, we're using our backticks to escape a return character. This can be very handy in certain situations, but generally you don't want to use it to escape a return character. Why? Because you're not rendering it, generally speaking. You're also generally not rendering white space. I have an extension for VS Code that highlights my trailing white spaces for this exact purpose. So now what we'll be doing is if we've put that space in there that you're ordinarily not going to see, we've just executed code. You can have unintended consequences from backticks, and you'll spend hours, if not days, if not weeks, trying to track them down. Ask me how I know. All right. Avoid using aliases. Anyone hazard a guess as to why? That's a good guess. Anyone else? Oh, that's a great question. What is an alias? Okay. No, I do not want to run updates. Excuse me one moment, folks. We have some technical issues. It keeps popping up every time I say remind me tomorrow. I didn't think I'd be that guy today. So what an alias is, while I'm troubleshooting this, is it's a nickname for a command. Instead of running select object, I might run select. And for those of you that also use Linux, that means that you'll be running the actual select command in Linux instead of maybe running select-object. You don't know how that command's going to be interpreted based on where it's going to be run. So as a best practice, you just want to use the actual command. All right, let me continue troubleshooting this one moment. All right, back to our regularly scheduled programming. So, in summary, some of these rules exist for a reason, such as not using aliases, such as indenting your code, readability things, right? There are some rules that are not hard in stone. I don't care necessarily whether you like to have your control your control keywords for each statement. I don't care if you want to have that being Pascal case or uppercase or lowercase. There are folks that debate about it, but it doesn't have any functional difference. As long as it's easy for you to read and you're consistent, that's all that matters. All right, let's just jump into some demo. So I'm going to be kind of going back and forth between demo and presentation. But let's create some parameters. If you don't know how to create a parameter, it's really, really simple. All we have to do is take some of those variables that we might have at the top of our script. Let's say we write a basic script and it's got hello world. You might assign in your write output statement variable equals hello world instead of actually calling it down as quoted text. So if we wanted to, we've got an example here that says, hello world, I like ponies and sunshine. Here's an example that has it as variables. And this is often the first step that folks start taking when they try to start modularizing their code, is they'll say, hey, I'm doing this common workflow, but I want to use variables, and that way I can just keep them at the top, I can change them out anytime that I need to make edits. And that's great, but it's not quite as flexible. By using parameters, all we have to do is take a param block and then put those variables that we've already created, complete with all of the things inside of equals, put that in the param block, and you have created parameters that have defaults. If I were to take out hello world or this equal, you would just have a blank variable. We haven't done anything with it, so at that point it's optional and this would do nothing. So let's play with this script. We'll pick on this one. Let me copy this path. And we'll just, for the sake of brevity, so let's just run it vanilla. Okay, expected output. But now I can start type greeting and it tab completes. It knows that there's a parameter there. So now I can give it any value I want. I could say, hi. Same thing for my other parameter. Hi, I like PowerShell. All right, any questions on that? Silence is golden. Now, if I removed anything after my equal sign, and I rerun this, let's leave off our greeting, see what happens. Nothing. Anybody hazard a guess as to why? Good, great answer. It's not mandatory. So in order to do that, we can create an attribute for it. So we create a parameter attribute, and we're going to say that mandatory is equal to true. So now when we rerun this, it prompts us for greeting. Now, there's nothing stopping me from just hitting enter, and still again, nothing happens. there's more validations that we can do. We can say, validate that this is not null. We can also say, validate that it's not null or empty, which tends to be my preferred, because there's nothing from stopping you from putting an empty string in there and hitting enter. So now let's try rerunning that. Did I hit save? No, that's not working as expected. Will in a parameter though, or sorry, in a function. All right, today I learned the demo gods have not been kind. Sorry? All right, so we've made this mandatory. There's a bunch of stuff that we can do that we're going to get into functions. How do we make a function? But first, what is a function? A function is basically just a commandlet. It's almost exactly the same thing, except it's not precompiled. It's not written in C#. It's not written in .NET. It's written in PowerShell. There are some other minor differences that we'll get into that we can make a function be treated a little bit more like a commandlet going forward. But there's a fundamental difference when you just say, function my awesome name, and put my code inside of it. Now, a quick note on naming. Your names should follow verb-noun conventions. So what does that mean? It means do-thing. So there's approved verbs out there from Microsoft. You can Google them, or if you're more inclined to use PowerShell to do that, they have built-in functionality. And you can use getVerb, and it will spit out a complete list of every supported and approved PowerShell verb for your use. You're also going to want to use a singular noun as a general rule, especially if you want to upload to the PS gallery. And functions need to be loaded into your scope in order to execute. So, does anyone know what a scope is? No? Okay. Well, I've got a function here. And we can see I've basically just taken our previous code, and I've put the function keyword in front of it, and I've said, write hello world, with some curly brackets. So let's let's just run that. Oh, hello world function. Okay, nothing happened. Why? Anyone want to take a guess?
You didn't call a function inside your script. It just loaded the function into memory.
Did it load the function into memory?
In some scope.
That's a great answer. It did load it. It loaded it into the script scope. So there's a scope for pretty much anything you run. If I have a for each loop, it's got its own scope. If I have any nested code block, it has its own scope. If I have a function, it has its own scope. The script has its own scope. Your session has a scope. They're all different. There is an inheritance, so we go from largest to smallest. So if I create a variable up in my in my global scope, it'll be inherited by anything in the script. But if I create it inside of a function or inside of a loop, and that terminates, that variable's gone. Poof, gone into the ether. So yes, it did get loaded into memory, but only while the script was executing, and then the script executed. As you rightly said, we did not call that function. Now, there's a thing that we can do called dot sourcing. Does anyone know about it? Anyone want to explain what it is? Anybody not know? Okay, so what dot sourcing does is it takes everything from a particular execution and it loads it into your local scope from wherever you're running that dot source. So let's see what that means. In here, we have function write hello world, and then we've created a variable. So just to illustrate that, hey, we can have this output our hello world and it functions as intended, we'll just call it. Okay, great, we get the expected output. Now, I can dot source this by just putting a dot in front of my execution. What this does is it pulls that function in. So let me do that from a net new PowerShell window, just to show that there is nothing up my sleeve. All right. So if I run write hello world, we can see that it's not loaded in. Let's check for my variable. We can see that there's nothing there. Now, if I were to dot source this, all of a sudden, I have write hello world available to me. That sounds great, right? So far, so good. Why do I need modules? I can just dot source everything, right? Well, the problem with this is I also grabbed my variable. I might not have wanted to. I might be using that variable somewhere else and I just overwrote it on accident. This can have unintended consequences. So we can make modules. And it turns out it's shockingly easy to do that. All we have to do is take our functions and then we change from a PS1 file to a PSM1 file. You just created a function, or sorry, created a module. Yes, it really is that simple. No, I'm not lying to you. So let's relaunch our session again. So now I'm going to run the import module command. And we have our write hello world function. Functions as intended. But do we have the my variable variable? No, we do not. That's one of the reasons why we want to use modules. All right, you guys can see that okay, so I'm not going to continue trying to full screen this. It just makes things easier. All right, that's just a slide showing what we just went over, how in order to create a function, all you need to do is put it in curly braces. Now, there's another cool thing that you can do. You can create help files very easily. It's called comment-based help. And all it relies on is a few keywords. We create a comment block, and we use those keywords. So let's pick on our function write hello world. First one is going to be synopsis. And this one's just going to be a brief description of what your function does. It only needs to be a sentence. This is super brief. The aptly named description field is going to be more verbose, give as much detail as you want here. Now we can describe our parameters. So, in our case, we've got two parameters. We're going to want to duplicate our parameter field, and we're going to want to give each of them a name that's equal to whatever our parameter is. So we've got greeting. We can drop the $sign. We'll just call it greeting. Additionally, we can have things like notes. These might be release notes, they might be bugs, they might be things that you want to keep internal or just want to make someone aware of. If you have this as a project on GitHub or you've got a PS Gallery, maybe you have some documentation that you want to refer to, you can put links in there. But let's go ahead and save this. These are probably some of the more common ones. Let's just see what this looks like. So I hit the save button. I can just write hello world again, right? I can do get help against that, right? Doesn't look like that did anything. Anyone know why? I do. Let's try that. Okay, still nothing. Any other guesses? Sorry? You do have to force it. And the reason why is because it's already been loaded into our session. So if this was a net new import, that would have done the trick. But because we're not aware of any changes to our module and we've already imported that module, we need to do it again with the force flag. So now we can see that we have some syntax that's been auto-generated. We also have what we filled in for synopsis and description. And then we have some automatically generated remarks. Examples are another one that you can create where I have that in the lab that you guys will be doing in a moment. So if I wanted to see the full thing, all I need to do is say -full. And we can see our parameters are listed as well, along with any attributes that we've assigned to it. So if we said that this is required, if we hit it with that mandatory flag, you would see true there. We can also see that this has common parameters. We'll get into those in just a moment. But this one's actually one of the less used, I find, when creating functions. All right, anybody know what a module manifest is? Nobody. All right, great. So a short description of it is it contains all of the metadata for a given module. And that might be things like versioning, it might be licensing, any external requirements that you have. Maybe you're requiring another module to be run or you need a certain version of PowerShell. It also allows you to choose which functions you export. There's a ton you can do with it, but this is really one of the places where the power of a module starts to come out. Any questions so far? All right. So when we create modules, there's two ways of really doing it. You can have a monolithic module where maybe I have a PSM1 file that contains all of my functions. And this can be great if you just want it to be a compact portable package. Maybe you don't want to manage 17 different function files. But I find that a lot of folks, particularly the folks that are publishing to the PS Gallery, a lot of them will split things out into public versus private, and they'll create a PS1 file for each of their function files. So let's take a look at what both of those look like. That's not the one. So in the case of splitting things out into a non-monolithic module, I have private, and if I were to load this module right now, you wouldn't see find book title, find book type, out book, split books, any of that. You would only see the things in this public directory. And the reason being is we have a module manifest that states I'm only exporting these functions. Anything that's not explicitly listed here will be available internally for a module to use. So let's say you create a helper function and it's useless outside of the context of your module. It's helping one of your other functions that you've written as part of a module do what it needs to do, but you don't want to expose that to an end user. Or you just don't want to see it when you run things in your PowerShell session. All you have to do is exclude it from this list. So the way that I've done that is I've just done dot sourcing. So I will get all of the PS1 files for each of these, I'll loop through, and dot source them into my PS1 file. And after that, I will update it with anything that's in the public folder. So every time I run an import, it's automatically updating my module manifest with whatever functions I created. If I were to create another PS1 file and throw it in the public directory right now, you would see that in the list the next time I did the import. And don't worry about taking pictures of this code. It's in the labs you guys downloaded. So for monolithic, we can see that it's all of the functions in one big file. Again, great for portability, but in terms of management and development, it gets a little unwieldy. If you have 500 functions in a single PSM1 file, you might have 20,000 lines of code. So, how do I create a module manifest? Well, that's actually fairly easy. All I have to do is use the new module manifest function. So in here, I can specify a path to my root module. I can specify where I want it to output. I can say author, GUID, all kinds of the metadata that you're going to see in this file. They're all available as switches. Any questions? All right, silence is golden. So now we've created modules. How do we know where they are automatically? Well, there is an automatic variable called PS module path. And what this is it's a semicolon separated values list of where PowerShell looks natively to find its modules. So I can edit this. Let's create a net new session again. Okay, good, I don't have it. And we'll just grab our demo path. That should do. Okay, let's confirm. So there it is. So now if I do a get module and I do a list available for, let's see, what did I call it? 05. Oh, the demo gods are not kind indeed. Let's grab one I know works. All right, we can see that we've found our module. The problem with this approach is if I were to quit this PowerShell session, the changes that I've made to my environment variable go away. Now, you can change it at a system level because it is an environment variable, so I can very easily go into system configuration properties and find the environment variable and set it. The thing to be aware of is this isn't scalable. This also affects anyone on a given system. So if you have different environments that you're trying to go back and forth between, if you make a change here and you're working on development code, you might have just pointed somebody's production at development. You can see why that would be an issue. So a better approach is to use what's called a profile. And basically, a profile is nothing more than a PowerShell script that runs every time you launch PowerShell. You can put anything you wanted. You could put message of the day. You could create your own custom prompts, custom functions, literally anything. So you can see I've customized my own prompt a little bit. I've created some functions. But let's modify our path for PS module path. So we can see that we've found it, we've imported it, and it was all done automatically because of our environment variable being set every single time we launch it through our profile. There it is. All right, before I get into a deep dive on some of the more interesting things you can do with functions, let's take a quick break. We're back to our regularly scheduled PowerShelling. So I had a great question about backticks while we were having our break of, well, what can I do instead? And what are some of the things that I can do if I wanted to maybe emulate some of it, but maybe using a pipeline? So we can create a parameters object is one of the first things that you can do instead of using backticks. So this is just a hash table. But you'll notice that the key, which is our name column here, that's equal to the same names that we're using for each of the parameters that we're going to expect. So let's see what I'm using in our example, new item. So if I were to type new item and start just tab completing, we can see path, we can see name, item type, and what if, obviously. But instead of trying to do this, I can just take that hash table that I created, and I can say at parameters. So in this case, it threw an error because, well, when we ran our bad code, it created it. So let's just go ahead and delete that. What did we call it? My folder. So now we can see it runs with what if. Another thing that you can do is if you're running commands in parallel, and let's say it's really long, I've got, if I can type, right? I've got command after command after command. Well, this gets pretty unwieldy pretty quickly, right? A lot of folks will start doing something like this. And again, backticks are bad. We hate backticks. What you can do instead is you can just simply hit enter after the pipeline. Because if it detects a carriage return after a pipeline, it will prompt for input. It will expect a continuation. Same thing applies to braces. If you have an open brace at the end of a line, it will expect more input. All right, we've talked a lot about how to create modules. Let's talk about functions a little bit more and dive into kind of what that means and some of the cool things that you can do with it. I'm actually going to pick on this one because this one's a great example. In here, I've got a ton of interesting things going on. The first of which is a little thing called commandlet binding. Does anyone know what that is, what it means? Does anyone care to take a guess? That's one of the things you can do with it. Yes, absolutely. Any other things that you think you can do with it?
It turns it into an advanced function, which gives it a bunch of default parameters and options that you don't get otherwise.
That's a great answer. That's exactly what it does. What are some of those things that I might get?
You get things like write verbose parameter,
Yep.
error action parameter.
Yep, absolutely. Those are the common parameters that we saw when we were looking at our auto-generated comment-based help. So that opens us up to use output streams. That's what those are called. And they don't actually write to the same output that you would get from the success stream. So if I were to run this command called initialize output path, and I were to create a folder, and I were to run it verbose, let's actually just do that. I think I've already got it imported into this session. All right, so let's initialize output path, and we'll say our file path is, actually we'll say folder path is equal to my folder. Well, in this case, we're going to capture this as a variable just so I can show what I'm talking about. So we'll say variable equals our command. Let's run it with verbose flagging. I actually wrote in some verbose messaging here. So it'll say what it's doing, or it'll say, hey, this already exists, and it'll grab the existing item. All right, we have our verbose messaging, but we didn't actually output the item that we grabbed. And that's because the success stream was grabbed in our variable capture, but we didn't grab any of our verbose messaging. This can be a really, really useful tool for you. If you're doing any kind of troubleshooting, if you're using write debug, you can actually have it prompt you for confirmation at every single point where you have it saying write debug. It'll say, do you want to continue? Here's the operation I'm about to do, yes or no. And so at that point, you can actually freeze it and start examining what exists from a variable standpoint. There are a ton of output streams. Some of the most common ones that you're going to see used, you probably already use write error. Write verbose is another great one that I recommend. There's a lesser known one that's called write information, and it's basically the same thing as write verbose. It's just a separate output stream for messaging purposes and messaging purposes only. Write debug we just went over. And there are a couple others I can't remember off the top of my head, but those are probably the most common ones that you're going to want to use. Write host, but that only goes to output to the console.
Right, and it's also an information stream. In newer versions of PowerShell, they redirected it to be the information stream.
Correct. But I'm talking about 7.5 today, so.
Right, and that's where it's redirected.
Right.
Like version, is it 5?
Yeah, I think it was 6,
6.
but don't quote me on this. It's not like they're recording it or anything. All right, another cool thing that commandlet binding affords us is having confirmation prompts. So I can say, do you want to proceed? Yes or no, for any operation I want. And how do I accomplish that? Well, there's a couple things that I have to do. First, I have to have commandlet binding. Then I have to specify as an argument to my commandlet binding attribute. I have to say that my confirm impact is either equal to or higher than what my default preference is. So I could set this to medium, sure, and it wouldn't prompt for confirmation. Or I could lower my confirm preference. So we can see mine is high. Actually, that's still a little small for you guys. Sorry about that. So we can see that mine's high. If I were to set this to medium, and I were to set this to low, I wouldn't get any confirmation prompts, but I might have things that would otherwise prompt for confirmation that wouldn't. So we've just loosened our safety valves. In general, unless you really know what you're doing with confirmation preference, you should just leave that one alone and you should adjust it here. Now, this is going to be universal to your function. So where we control what gets prompted for confirmation versus what doesn't is going to be anything inside of this if statement. And the magic here is pscommandlet.shouldProcess. ShouldProcess is a method, and it's part of the automatic variable called pscommandlet that's only available if you're using commandlet binding. So this only exists at runtime. If I were to go and type pscommandlet right now, I'm not going to actually see anything because right now it doesn't exist. It only exists in a function at runtime. But there's plenty of documentation out there on it. So ShouldProcess is a method that we want. The first item here that we're referencing is actually the target, which is basically our variables. So we can see that I'm setting this new path variable here based on input from my parameter set name, which is another really cool option that you get. So I can have different sets of commands, different sets of parameters that are at odds with each other. And what that means is they can't be combined. So we can see I have folder path and file path. But if we look at them again, we'll see that I have assigned a parameter set name. One of them is folder, one of them is file. If these were both named the same thing, they would be able to work just fine with one another. But since they're different names, they'll error out. So let's see what that looks like in action. All right, that's expected behavior. So basically it says, hey, look, you have two conflicting parameter sets. Pick one. Another cool thing that we can do with our parameter sets is we can set a default parameter set name. Now, if you don't pick one, under the hood, there is one called all parameter sets, and it's preceded by 2 underscores. If you do not specify a parameter set name and you create a parameter, it's shared between all of your different parameter sets. So you can have some that float between and some that are only grouped specifically together with one another. So just for grins, let's create another, and we'll call it write output. And we'll make it a switch. So now we've saved, and we'll have to import again with the force flag because we've already imported. Let's make it do something. All right, so this is prompting for confirmation because I have a high confirm impact, and I have a confirmation prompt here stating, hey, would you like to perform an operation? So we can see I have create file. So in that case, that's the name of my parameter set name that I invoked based on our switches. So I type file path. And our target is new path. So it's saying, hey, is this what you want to do on this target? This is my message. In our case, sure. But you can see before we got that confirmation prompt, it did actually do output. And the reason being is because this was put before our if statement. Anything that's outside of this if statement for ps_commandlet.should process will execute regardless of your confirmation. That can be before, it can be after. You could have multiple should process statements inside of a function. And so maybe you create a set of files or you create a folder and then it's going to prompt, hey, do you want to create 1,000 files? Or do you want to do a rename operation? Any questions on how that works? That's completely up to you. It's situational. Let's say you wanted to do some get operations. I wanted to get a number of folders and see whether or not they exist, maybe do some testing. but I only want to prompt on modification. In that case, you would only put the modification commands inside of that if statement. But that's completely up to you. There's nothing saying that you had to do it that way. I mean, coding is very much akin to creative writing. It's choose your own adventure. Any other questions on? Yes?
Would you have a try catch within the function or only outside of the function?
In what context?
Like, you're trying to create your file, right? What if there was some kind of error that you couldn't create this file? Like for error handling.
That's something that you would do inside of the function itself. Or you could set your error action preference to fail inside of a function. That's something that I like to do. And that's for just making try-catch blocks predictable. So in our case, I think the version of this, I can illustrate that point. So hold one moment. Let me just double check my code here and make sure I've got the right version.
Because personally, I like to do a lot of try catches,
I agree, 100%.
Good files.
Okay, great. So I'm going to intentionally break this. This doesn't have any error handling in it. There are different types of errors. There's terminating and non-terminating errors. So in our case, new item's a non-terminating error. And I'm going to use some illegal characters here, and I'm just going to break our initial output path. All right, so in our case, I just created a bunch of files, and we can see that it bombed out because I have illegal characters, I have things that already exist, but we can see that it looped through it each time. I have no error handling there. This is a non-terminating error. I can actually control that by using error action preference. That's one way of handling things. So let's say you didn't want to be bothered with putting try-catch statements inside of your function. You wanted to keep it as simple as possible, make it as minuscule as you can. You could just have it fail on first attempt no matter what, and then handle your try-catch outside of the function. Or you could put a try-catch inside of it if you already had another workflow that you wanted it to do. But let's see what just changing our error action preference does. So we have preference variables, and we can see here our error action preference is continue. And I'm actually just going to launch a new PowerShell session. All right. So it's continue. Make sure I saved that. We'll import this again. And we'll run our same command for initialize output path. We can see it stopped on the first one this time. Now, does everybody remember what I said about scopes? Yes? No? Okay, great. So, what should my error action preference be? Anybody want to take a guess? Why? Because I only changed my error action preference for my function scope. So the second that my function terminated its execution, we went back to what our global scope was, our session scope, which is continue. So let's confirm that. Now another way that you can do it is you can actually put the try-catch block inside of it. So in our case, we can see, hey, look, try this. If you can't create that item, just throw an error, and then we'll handle it outside of that. Any other questions on commandlet binding? All right. Let's talk about begin process and end blocks. And also a clean block. So, first things first. A begin block is an optional block. It will only process once when a function is run. A process block is fundamentally different because anything I pass from the pipeline is going to be looped through. It's kind of like a built-in for each loop. And I can control that using the value from pipeline argument in my parameter attribute. So I can pass this a bunch of folders and just loop through it, and it'll create them without the need for a for each loop. And let me make sure I'm using the right version here. Actually, we'll just copy paste this one in. Now, helps if you put your quotes in the right places. All right, so we can see we've looped through. What the process block will do is each time it encounters an item from the pipeline, it will loop through that item. But it will only loop through it if you've assigned value from pipeline to an argument. Now, similarly, if you have an object, you could say value from pipeline by property name. And if I had an object that I was passing that had the name folder path as a property name, it would process that automatically and it would ignore any other properties that it encounters in that object. But it would loop through those folder paths. And you can assign that to multiples when you're doing it by property name. If I had 20 different arguments that were under the parameter set name folder, I could say value from pipeline by property name for each of them, and if I had an object that corresponded to each of them, it would automatically know where to place those arguments just from the pipeline. All right. Yes, for anything inside of the process block. Now, if I have a begin block, any commands that I put inside that begin block are going to run once, and once only. And it's going to run before that process block occurs, before the first execution, not before every execution.
I was thinking, like, if you're copying like 10 new columns from one to another, would it take off the first one, or would it wait after the
That depends on whether or not the command that you ran internally inside that process was asynchronous. So if you're running that copy operation and you're saying, hey, just kick this off as a background job, then that command, as far as it's concerned, has executed and it's going to continue the execution of the process block. But if the process block hangs for any reason, it's going to wait. And that's potentially something you could control with a switch, maybe. Where if you had a value for a command and you wanted to run it in parallel, maybe, I would probably actually do that with a for each loop rather than relying on a process block, because then you could run it with the dash parallel switch, and that allows you to run those concurrently. But in that case, you'd lose functionality of the process block, so you wouldn't be able to rely on the pipeline. i.e., I couldn't run get VM and grab 1,000 VMs and then pipe it in. I would have to do get VM and then pipe that to a for each dash parallel. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's a great question. All right, one of the other blocks that is commonly seen is the end block. And it's just like the begin block. Anything that I pass to it is going to execute once, but after the process block is done. Any questions on how any of that works? The last one that was introduced, I think in PowerShell 7.3, was the clean block. And what it does is it will execute regardless of whatever errors might be thrown. If you encounter a terminating error, and let's say I create connections to a bunch of different arrays, maybe vCenter, I open up some network connections, or I have maybe some temporary files that I'm staging somewhere. This will perform any cleanup actions that you want it to. The one caveat to be aware of is it will not allow you to pass anything to the success stream. So you couldn't output final results. You could do it in the verbose messaging stream or maybe an error messaging stream, but not success. All right. Any questions on any of that before we move on? Let's see, we've already covered profiles. All right, last thing. Now we've created a PowerShell profile, or sorry, we've created a PowerShell module. We've got it just the way we like it, and we want to publish it. How do we go about doing that? Well, it's actually fairly easy. We only need a few things. We need to have a module manifest. And it's got to contain some metadata. So it's got to have a unique name. It's got to have an author. It's got to have semantic versioning. So if we scroll up here, we can see I've got all of these things. Okay. And then in my case, I chose the MIT license. But we got to have all of those filled in. Other than that, you have to have a valid module file. So we can test that. There's a couple of different things that we can do. So there's tools from Microsoft that are available for testing both of these things individually. So PS Script Analyzer, who's heard of it? Has anybody used it? Okay. Got one or two? PS Script Analyzer is exactly what it sounds like. It's a linting tool. It'll tell you if there's any glaring errors, warnings, things that you need to be aware of in your scripts. So let's run it against this. We'll run it against the whole folder. I don't have it installed on 7. Let me open PowerShell 5. Okay, no news is good news. Came back clean. Let's go back to one of our earlier modules where there's a couple of mistakes and things that we need to be aware of and see what that looks like. So we can see we've got a bunch of warnings here. It looks like most of these are fairly benign. We've got a couple of wild cards, things that we need to address, manually change. We can see that my naming standards aren't up to best practices here, and I've got a couple of unused variables. These are things that you could normally ignore, but just for the sake of completeness, making sure that our code is clean and that we don't have to go back later and fix things, we address them when we find them. So I fixed these in the latest version. Let's go back to PowerShell 7. And the other command that we can use is test module manifest. Am I in the right path? I'm not. Okay, so if we had an invalid module manifest, this would not come back with a return. This would error out. But we can see that everything looks good. We've tested it. It's happy. We're pretty much ready to publish. So let me just change some versioning or something in here. So now all we need to do is sign into our Microsoft account at PS Gallery. .com. So if you've never signed into the PowerShell Gallery, you'll just need to sign up. It'll pass through and ask you to sign in with your Microsoft account. And then we need to go to our profile and generate a key. Guess somebody's running updates. Absolutely.
So I have a module which has about 130 functions, and it's quite big. Is there any way to outsource just a function from that module?
A single function?
Function
It would dot source all of the modules, or sorry, all of the functions in the module file. So in that case, I'd recommend splitting them out. In the labs that were in that link, I included a function that I just wrote quick and dirty called split module, which should actually be able to parse that file, find it, split them all into individual files. So you could try giving that a whirl and splitting them out, making a non-monolithic module, and hopefully you'll have some luck with that. No, unfortunately, it's going to run the whole thing through. Now, if you had them split out into a non-monolithic module, you could just dot source that one file and it would do it. So your use case might be a great example where you want to split those files out. All right, so we need to generate ourselves an API key. In our case, I already have one. I generated it for the summit. Let's just regenerate it real quick. So if we were to create a new one, there's a couple of things you need to do. You need to give it a name, give it an expiration, and then give it a couple of scopes. What do we want it to be able to do? These are fairly self-explanatory. For those of you that are maybe less familiar with what a glob pattern is, this is basically going to be what package names is this going to be allowed to touch. You could just throw a wildcard in here and it has universal permissions to do anything. But ideally you would create an API key that's only patterned to the exact name of whatever your module is going to be. Make sense? All right. So I already have one. We regenerated it. Let me just copy that real quick. And we can see that one's only good for a day, and it is locked down to that exact context, so I have no problem showing you guys in plain text. Unless you're that fast. If you can beat me, you shouldn't be in this lab. But now we can just run the publish module command. And we give it the path to the folder in which our module resides. We supply it an API key. And I did not create that as a variable yet, so let's do that. So we'll confirm that it has a value we want. And now we'll go ahead and publish. All right. Hopefully here, the Wi-Fi here is good. Okay, we're going to give that a couple minutes. In the meantime, are there any other burning questions? All right. Let's see if we can find it. Sometimes it's pretty quick. And there it is. up in the PS gallery. And we can confirm that out in the GUI too. Looks like it's not returning in the GUI yet, but it's still out there. Yes, sir. All right, let's break for snacks. All right, I think most folks are back. All right, so I've gone over most of the technical demo that I wanted to do and discuss today, but I wanted to end more on philosophy. All right, so we've kind of discussed how we go from using a static script to evolving it a little bit to use variables, and then changing those to parameters to make your scripts even more flexible. And at a certain point, we start developing functions. Those functions can live inside a script, they can live inside a module. Sometimes you want to use one, sometimes you want to use the other. So that begs the question, what should be a function? And the short answer is, think of it as a Swiss Army knife. It's something that's really compact, it's really useful in a lot of situations. It serves maybe one or two purposes. It doesn't have a ton of moving parts, not a lot there to break. Try to make this as molecular or atomic as possible. You shouldn't have a 3,000 line function. If it's small, lightweight, compact, useful, you should probably make a function. What should not be a function? Too much of a good thing, right? Well, I like functions. Everything should be a function. I'm going to put functions inside of functions inside of functions. That's generally not something you're going to want to do because you're going to wind up chasing your own tail. You're going to encounter all kinds of different references to different things that are broken in different parts of the code. So if this is something that's maybe niche or something where you try to create an all-in-one where it does everything, it's not going to do any one of those things individually well. In that kind of case where you have a particular given scenario, maybe create small functions that serve a particular purpose, don't expose them, and then just run a script. So you can string them together, load your module, and then run a script to accomplish whatever you want your all-in-one solution to be. It's much easier from a troubleshooting perspective, from a versioning perspective, just keeping track of where everything is. So let's pick on the example that I used for the labs. Okay, so in this case, we have our really ugly script that we started with. And eventually, we fixed the formatting, we made it look pretty, we gave it some comments, we said, hey, here's the things that we're doing. And then we went a step further, we gave it parameters, and then we started creating functions. So we've got some helper functions here. And these are just very simple shorthand ways of writing functions. You'll see I don't have a lot of the validations and things that we had on initialize output path. But it's a singular thing. This serves one purpose and one purpose only, and it's to perform a trim operation and a split operation. But it's a lot easier for me to read in the context of the script to make it a helper function. Is this something that I need to export to an external module somewhere that I'm then going to reference 1,000 times in 1,000 other places? Probably not. This is probably something you just want to keep as part of a script. That's totally okay. They can live there. Nothing wrong with that. But in some cases where you go through that exercise, where I'm making all of these functions, I might encounter one gem of an idea, or maybe it's this initialize output path. Well, that seems like something that would be useful in my day-to-day life. Let me make that a function, and let me maybe export that to a module that I can put in my little toolkit. That is a Swiss Army knife. So, in the context of this particular example, we have a script. This is not a module, this is just a script. It's got some parameters. We've created functions inside of our script. These are helper functions. They inherit all the parameters that are passed to our script. And they have specific outputs that they return. But the bulk of my script is this. And we can see by creating helper functions, I don't even really have to troubleshoot what the logic of what I'm trying to do is. It's all plain text. That's the power of functions, that's the power of modules. But remember, just because you can do something doesn't necessarily mean you should. This shouldn't be a non-monolithic module. Ultimately, if I were going to use this in production, this is a unitasker. I'm taking one book and I'm splitting it. But I probably should create helper functions just to make it easy to read. And if I were doing this for a client, for production use, or for personal enrichment, this is the way that I would wind up doing it. Not my final example, which we actually wound up publishing to the gallery, which is the same thing. I just have it split out into public versus private. This is not what I would do for this particular use case. You have to know what your end goal is when you're creating functions and creating scripts and modules. And that is pretty much all I had for you guys. I wanted to leave a couple hours for you guys to be able to run through the labs. I'll be hanging out. I'll be walking around. If you got any questions, feel free to flag me down. And, you know, I'll happily share with the rest of the folks if there's any great questions that we have. Maybe do some more demo. Thank you.